Hi, Geoff.
Well, how are you doing, Will?
I'm doing very, very well. I'm Will Wilkinson here at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Free Will, and you are Geoffrey Sayre-McCord. And tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, Geoff.
I'm a philosopher down in Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina, and I work in moral theory and metaethics and theory of knowledge. Is that enough about me?
That's great. You're a philosophy professor at UNC, now I know your work. I was in grad school as a philosophy student. Never quite finished, but had a lot of metaethics courses, and I read a few of your papers. But metaethics is a sort of just a funny sounding name. I don't think a lot of people know exactly what that means. So what's the difference between just like regular old ethics, metaethics, normative ethics, applied ethics? There's all these different sort of fields. Can you give us a quick breakdown of what makes these sort of distinct areas of inquiry?
I think I can, but in doing so, I'm not going to leave them wholly distinct because
Sure.
I don't think they're completely separate. A way to lay them out is to think of, start with what's common and familiar, which is our practice of thinking and talking about what it would be best to do or what it would be right to do or what we ought to do even if we don't feel as if we should, as if we want to. Take that practice, and engaging in that is engaging in moral thought and talk.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are various things we can wonder about in doing that. One thing we might do is take our various thoughts and try to generalize them, try to get principles to back up our judgments, develop arguments against the judgments of others. Anytime you find yourself disagreeing, for instance, about whether capital punishment needs to be done in a humane manner or whether it's ever justified, or in thinking about whether people ought to have abortions or if it's permissible for them to have abortions, at what point, or whether it's permissible or not, whether it's permissible for the government to be involved. In each of these cases, I've meant to mention topics about which sincere, honest people disagree. Mm-hmm. And that raises a challenge to anyone who cares about this stuff to try to figure out whether there's a way they can justify their particular views. And when you move from making the judgments to reflecting on your reasons for them, you're moving into moral theorizing. Mm-hmm. And that move is the move from what's often called applied ethics, mm-hmm. coming to terms with specific judgments about specific cases, to finding more general principles that underwrite, explain, and justify mm-hmm. those judgments. And as you might expect, that process can go on for quite a long time, getting very general, with deep puzzles about the nature of value and the nature of right action. All of that is moral theorizing. Metaethics tries to take all of that phenomena and bump up a level. Mm-hmm. And so ask of our thinking and talking about particular cases and making moral judgments about those, and also attempting to get principles to systematize those judgments. Take all of that and ask, what are we doing here? Are we talking about something? Are we expressing our tastes? Are we getting at facts that we might get right or wrong? Mm-hmm. Is there a way to justify these judgments? How is the value of treating those in need kindly? How is that value related to their living longer and they're not suffering pain? Mm-hmm. Those are all issues in metaethics. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is, in registering it as meta, we're going up a level and trying to explain what at the level we're studying we were doing.
Or maybe even if there's questions like if there are moral facts out there in the world, how is it that we know them?
Right. What would they be, and how could we possibly learn about them?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that a little bit now that we know a little bit about what metaethics is. You are something of an authority on the question of moral realism, which is, I guess, just the question about whether or not there are moral facts in the world that are sort of independent of us, things out there in virtue of which our moral beliefs are true or false. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of contemporary debate in about moral realism, how that kind of breaks down, and is there a consensus view, or is it just hotly contested?
Both. So let me back up a step to
Sure.
the way you set it up, and there are actually different ways that people characterize what moral realism involves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the bones of contention whether, for instance, the facts at issue need to be independent of us,
mm-hmm.
depending on what you mean by independent of us. Mm-hmm. So I feel as if I've just made a Clinton move. It depends what you mean by is here. So
yeah. Well, so there's a big literature about things like response-dependent properties and things like that. So, right,
that's exactly right. So
mm-hmm.
you might think there's a fact of the matter about what's blue or yellow, but also think that something counts as blue or yellow only because they're perceivers like us who have certain reactions to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that thinking about colors makes sense only in a context where you have beings who can have color perceptions, for instance. Mm-hmm. If you have that kind of view, there's a sense in which the colors are not independent of us. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, any particular person's judgment that something is yellow or blue or green can be literally true or false, can get the facts wrong, can be a case where the person's subject to illusion or
mm-hmm.
just confused. So one issue in the moral realism debate is in what sense and to what degree do the putative moral facts have to be independent of us in order for us to have established that there are really moral facts. Mm-hmm. So against the background of that, my preferred way of characterizing moral realism is that a moral realist is someone who thinks of our moral judgments that say slavery is wrong, that some of the moral judgments, for instance that one, are true. And true not as a way of speaking, but literally true. Made true by certain facts, true in a way that other people who have different opinions are getting mm-hmm. something wrong. If that's the characterization of realism, it's a pretty abstract and capacious characterization mm-hmm. because it now allows for debate about what it would take to make such judgments right. literally true.
Well, that's a more semantic characterization of the realism debate, right? Because you could make it in terms of if there are questions in science, say, about whether or not you're going to be a realist about a particular hypothetical entity or property, right? The question is, well, do I need? So suppose I want to, whether I'm going to be a realist about neutrons or not. Right? And so there's a question about whether I need to posit neutrons in order to explain the observed phenomena. And so in that sense, the question is just about whether a kind exists or not necessarily about whether claims about the kind are true or false.
I
already
think
getting into these complicated issues, right? Right. When you're trying to, yeah.
So let me take that good case. There is in science, and you get the same sort of distinction between people making particular judgments about what things broke what other things.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get scientific theory, which is the attempt to systematize, explain, and organize those judgments. And then you can get philosophy of science, which, like metaethics, is the attempt to figure out, so what's going on when people are involved in doing that? And there is, just as you're pointing out, a debate about scientific realism, which is, should we understand? Now, I'll put it in my terms first, and then relate it to what you said. So these scientists, they're talking about electrons all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Should we take that talk at face value and suppose that in making claims about this happening because of certain things electrons are doing or certain things that are happening with electrons? Should we take that at face value? In which case, as I'll characterize it, you're being a realist about it, holding that claims about the electrons are literally true. Or one attractive view in philosophy of science is to be an instrumentalist and to say, all you need to suppose scientists are doing is creating a framework for predicting and controlling the world around them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this little phrase they use, electron, that plays a role in their theories, but no reason to suppose that claims about electrons are made true by things in the world. They're just useful or not. That would be an anti-realist reading of scientific theories. One of many. And then what you did, which is right to the point, is you said, here's a central argument about electrons. People come in and they say, well, shouldn't we believe there really are electrons if, supposing there are, figures in our best explanations? And this is a general strategy, really, for what we should believe is true.
Mm-hmm.
And so one person who's famous for developing this kind of argument is Gilbert Harman. And it's a theory of what the grounds are for legitimately believing something, legitimately taking something to be true. And what Harman argues in the science case is we legitimately believe there are electrons, that is, claims that there are electrons are literally true, if, but only if, they figure in our best explanations.
Mm-hmm.
He then moved it over to ethics and said, if you accept this criterion, this explanatory criterion, then notice, he pointed out, that it looks as if we don't have to suppose claims about bad acts have to be true in order to explain anything.
Mm-hmm.
We can do all the explaining while supposing the moral claims aren't true at all.
So that would be an example then of just moral anti-realism, right?
Exactly.
So
based on the same argument you were developing.
Mm-hmm. So if we say that something's really out there just in case we need it as part of our best theory of something,
or at least we're justified.
We're justified in thinking that it's out there. There's nothing about moral behavior. There's no observations that we can make that are really helped by thinking that there is wrongness. We can explain all the data that's observed in just by saying that people are emoting. There's conventions that people have picked up through their development. There's different cultural norms. People are, doing their thing according to the norms, according to the way that they've been brought up, expressing all sorts of tastes and emotions. These have real effects on the way people coordinate with one another, but moral facts aren't part of the story. So what's wrong with that?
Well, that's exactly what the challenge is, and let me follow that through with you in a minute. I just want to notice that the move I was making was in essence to take your example from philosophy of science and then the extension that Gil Harman makes to ethics, and I in effect semanticized it. As you said, it's a semantic characterization.
Yeah.
What Harman has proposed is, if you're asking, should I believe this is true? His proposed criterion is, yes, you're justified in believing it's true if supposing it's true figures in one of your best explanations. And then Harman's claim is, we do have to suppose claims about electrons are true. in order to have our best explanations of the phenomena. But we don't have to suppose our moral judgments are true in order to explain all of the available phenomena. So we should believe the electron claims are true, and we shouldn't believe the moral claims are true. That's the pattern, and I was just trying to tie the semantic move to the specific argument. And then, so let's go to that argument, just to take your question. There are a couple of things, a couple of different puzzles people have about that style argument. One puzzle has to do with whether it's genuinely true that all of our best explanations can go through without supposing certain moral claims are true as well. And this gets tricky fast. So
what are some examples of things that people think that we need to posit moral facts in order to make sense of?
So one sort of common example is take some horrific act that somebody performed consciously and willingly. You can go to a case of Hitler or Stalin, or take any character you want who initially your judgment is they're evil people. Mm-hmm. And that only an evil person could have done what they did. Then ask yourself the question, could we explain what happened? As we observe all these people dead. Could we explain what happened and explain it equally well, even supposing the murderer wasn't evil? Mm-hmm. And then the question becomes, well, what are you supposing when you're supposing someone isn't evil? Are you supposing, for instance, they don't... And now you have to fill in your view of what constitutes evil.
Right.
But let's say your view is what constitutes evil is cold-heartedly, willingly slaughtering people of another group for your own ends without regards to theirs. Mm-hmm. If you thought that constituted evil, then to imagine that Hitler isn't evil is to imagine him not doing any of those things.
Right.
And if he weren't doing any of those things, then there wouldn't be millions of people dead. Mm-hmm. And so some people have argued, really our best explanation of what happened during World War II depends on the evilness of Hitler. If you tried to explain it while supposing Hitler wasn't evil, you couldn't explain it.
Well, so let's...
Hitler... Go ahead.
Yeah, so but if we then unpack the idea of evil, and if what you said was just having a kind of, cold-hearted disregard for, the suffering of other people, yada yada, how is that property a moral property? You can just redescribe, you can say, isn't this a good characterization of what evil is? A certain kind of monumental callousness to suffering, and then say that's just a natural fact of the world, and that of course, a certain kind of indifference to suffering and sort of a motivation to serve your ends come what may explains things. But there's nothing distinctively, there's not a special kind of fact lurking in that explanation.
Well, so I don't think I quite cheated, but I asked you to suppose you thought that constituted evil. Mm-hmm. You can't both say, yes, it does, and say, well, that's there, but evil isn't.
Yeah.
So what you can do is say, Geoff, that argument doesn't work because I agree I can't explain all the dead without appealing to the monumental callousness. Mm-hmm. But to appeal to monumental callousness is just to appeal to certain natural facts and not to say anything at all about evil. Mm-hmm. And that's right. That's the problem with this reply is a lot of people think that there's a feature evilness which things have which are over and above and separable from, in an important way, the ways of being naturalistically that you might at first think constitute being evil. Mm-hmm. And if they are separate, then you're absolutely right. You can have your explanation and deny the evil at the same time. But, let's go to a parallel, again, moving away from morality. There's a popular, plausible view of tables and chairs. That's that they're constituted by molecules. Mm-hmm. And it looks as if we can explain everything that happens in the world by uphill just to the molecular level. And so you can explain why I'm sitting on a chair now, not falling down, by not actually paying attention to me or the chair I'm sitting on, but by shifting to the molecular level. Mm-hmm. Does that show that my body doesn't exist or that the chair doesn't exist? Most people are inclined to say not at all, because what it is for there to be that chair is just constituted by there being a collection of molecules with certain structural properties and dependencies. Mm-hmm. And so
this is the difference between the idea that there can be a higher order property or thing. You can sort of reduce it into a lower order constituents. You can say this thing is made up of these things, and you can describe it at either level. But to reduce it to a lower level of explanation isn't to eliminate the thing that you're explaining.
That's exactly right. There's a phrase that's mostly in philosophy of mind, a phrase called eliminative materialism, mm-hmm. which is the view that once you embrace materialism and understand all its implications, you should see that it requires rejecting the idea that there are actually beliefs or desires or thoughts. And so what you are is on materialistic grounds, you eliminate the psychological characterizations. There's also room, of course, but this is talked about much less in this term. Mm-hmm. There's room for retentive materialism that says, well, I think the world is all material, but that's my reason for thinking beliefs and desires are constituted by certain material things.
Yeah.
And that's an attitude towards beliefs and desires that has you seeing them constituted in a certain way rather than seeing the materialism as grounds for rejection. And we get the same sort of structure here with the choice in the moral case and the chair case. It's true, a lot of people are a little inclined to be retentive about tables and chairs mm-hmm. and eliminative about the moral properties. But then there's this nice pressure to say, what's the grounds for the difference? Mm-hmm. Why do you think evilness requires anything more than callous disregard for the welfare of other human beings? Mm-hmm. Some people say it does require more, and then the challenge is to say, what more?
Mm-hmm. But suppose we accept that. So suppose we accept that you've given a good definition of evil, and so we'll just work with this stipulation that evil is the callous disregard for the welfare of others. Do people have some? Is there some idea then that we've just defined this moral property, evilness, in terms of a complex natural property? So moral properties are really just natural properties, and so if we wanted to, we could. It's not to say that there are no moral properties, but we could explain everything that's happening without actually referring to moral properties, if we wanted to. That the moral properties are a kind of they take a cognitive load off. They're summing a lot of things up, but. To say that it's evil isn't to add anything over and above the fact that it's a callous disregard for the welfare of others. So we could keep the whole conversation on that more obvious, naturalistic, descriptive level instead of, and that might be more useful, perhaps.
So there's a couple of things to say about that mm-hmm. line of reasoning, which seems to me just the right one to be following through. So the first thing to say is it's probably not plausible to define evil as simply the callous disregard, because it seems as if there are other ways a person might be evil without embodying just callous disregard. Although it might be a pretty good definition, I have to admit, but I want to leave room for someone to say, I'm not happy with saying that's an adequate definition. Mm-hmm. All I want to say is, when you have callous disregard, you do have evil. Mm-hmm. There may be other ways, other things that constitute evil that don't involve callous disregard. Mm-hmm. They might involve, this just came to me as a possibility, malicious regard.
Yeah.
And so I pay a lot of attention to you solely with the intention of doing everything I can to hurt you.
I'm positively interested in causing you suffering. Yeah.
Exactly. And that may be, someone might
pretty
want
evil.
to say, yeah, that does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so the thing I want to leave room for is that the argument I was giving you before was an argument that depended on you admitting that callous disregard in this case constituted evil, but didn't really require you saying it's the definition of evil. Either way, the next step in what you did is say, well, if we go that way, and so we've got grounds to be retentive moralists, instead of saying there is no evil, we have grounds for saying, no, there's evil precisely because there is callous disregard and malicious regard and whatever else we might come up with. Can't we then do without the moral talk? Or shouldn't we then think, well, the moral talk
what's
is
it adding?
A convenient summary, but it doesn't seem to be adding anything. And you might say that, recognizing that it's a useful shorthand, nonetheless. Now, some people want to say, it's not adding anything, you're right, because we've already admitted we've got everything. That is, we have all the evil we need when we have a case of malicious disregard. And now there is a choice. Which way do you want to talk about it? Mm-hmm. But that choice isn't introducing two things, one of which proves to be odious. It's that we have one thing that we can describe in either of two ways.
Yeah.
Other people want to come in and say, actually, if you increase the resolution, so to speak, and move from talk of evil in its various manifestations to just talk about this particular case of evil, this malicious disregard, you'll miss some truths that are only capturable at the general level. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, if we tried to describe everything that happens sitting-wise in my house by appeal to the molecular structure of things, you'd miss all sorts of patterns of tables not sat upon and stools sat upon, where it's not until you go up a level to not their molecular description, but some of their social functional role, that you get that this is a stool, not a small table.
Well, maybe
or that you get this as a work of art chair, not a to be sat in chair. And so there are people who argue that trying to drill down to the molecular level or drill down to the malicious disregard level are people who will lose nothing in the particular instance, but they'll lose important real patterns that are there.
Well, one of the sort of, I think, when you're thinking about, like, suppose we decided to, suppose we're happy with our naturalistic account of all the moral properties, and we decide that one day we're going to talk, we're going to give up the moral language, and we're going to just use the naturalistic account. It might take longer, but we're going to just talk this way. Will we be missing something? And it seems like you definitely will be missing something, because the sort of ordinary moral vocabulary seems to have a certain kind of emotional or motivational kick to it. that somewhat more descriptive language doesn't. So to tell somebody that they've done something wrong, or that that's good, or that that's right, that they've been unjust, and there are thicker and thinner moral terms, but distinctively moral language seems to kind of have a bit of a motivational punch to it that more merely empirical language doesn't seem to have.
I think that's right, but it's not clear to me that the contrast is an essential one.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me quite often, or at least it gets tricky fast, because it seems quite often that certain things that you might think are clear candidates for being descriptive can get picked up and used moralistically.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not hard to imagine raising your kids in an environment where you don't use the term cruel at all. But every time you see them being malicious, say,
mm-hmm.
what are you doing? That's awfully mean or
mm-hmm.
malicious. Or why aren't you paying attention to your brother?
Mm-hmm.
Where on one way,
you are disregarding the pain of this dog.
Yeah, exactly. Which is something that can be said pejoratively
uh-huh.
in tone and pejoratively in practice. A lot of people report perfectly accurately of all sorts of things. That's disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
But the way of doing it is a way of putting in place motivational pressures
mm-hmm.
that, on the one hand, might be acknowledged and rejected. So I'm a big fan of dim sum, and
mm-hmm.
when I go for dim sum, there are various things I eat about which people truly report, that's disgusting, which is part of the pleasure of eating these things. The chicken's feet or the tripe or...
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which you could say, no, when somebody says, that's disgusting, with that look on their face, they're really using moral language or
mm-hmm.
evaluative language. But if you do that, you're starting to cheat on the distinction.
Yeah. Well, so some people say, and this gets to another sort of key distinction in the realism, anti-realism debate, that it kind of looks on the surface, there's just grammatically, people are making claims that seem like they could be true or false. This is wrong, that is right. But people aren't really expressing beliefs that are true or false. People
right.
are just expressing certain kinds of attitudes or expressing certain kinds of emotions, and that view is called non-cognitivism, right? So
right.
What I don't for my own part, I'm not sure whether or not I'm a realist or an anti-realist or a cognitivist or non-cognitivist these days. It's actually hard to tell. Because I've come to think that a lot of moral language, people definitely are making claims and they dispute them, and they do talk like we talk to each other like we're not, like the disagreement is meaningful.
Right.
That we're not just expressing attitudes like, I like vanilla, I like chocolate, right? I mean, that's not really a debate. You're just expressing different attitudes.
Right.
But at the same time, it seems when you start to think about, what's really the function or the role of morality at all? Why do we have moral language? Why do we have moral practices? Why are there moral sentiments? It seems like it has something to do with a certain kind of social coordination, that we're trying to create and reinforce certain kinds of patterns of social interaction that have certain kinds of consequences. And now, I don't know if... I think some of those consequences are good consequences. Mm-hmm. So I think that a pattern of social coordination or cooperation that leads people to have long lives, to be healthy, to be rich, to realize some sort of basic human capacities, that's a good result. And that people sharing a certain set of moral norms and conventions that sort of prod us all into sort of heeding these norms and conventions in a way that does give rise to this pattern of interaction that has these good results. I don't know whether or not if that's what I think is going on with morality, and I say that's wrong, partly I know that I'm just saying that here's a local convention about saying what's wrong and right that I'm hoping will have a certain kind of motivational effect on you. But the reason I want it to have a certain motivational effect is that that plays a small part in a bigger pattern of social interaction that has a real payoff in terms of how well people do. So is that kind of view realist or anti-realist? Or would I have to say more?
Well, I'm not. So what I would do is, I'm sorry, I'm feeling torn in going to two directions because what you said is very rich. So, but the two things I want to flag, and maybe we can pursue them both, is one is the question of whether this counts as realism, and the other is the question of what's the difference between saying, well, what morality is merely a tool to regulate and coordinate, which is not quite what you said, and saying what you said, which is it's a tool to regulate and coordinate for the sake of achieving good results.
Yeah.
The latter view, naturally invites attention to what do you mean by good results. And so I want to go to that in a minute, but let's go to the realism thing first.
Okay.
Because I think I can connect them in a way. So let's switch again. This is often a good way to get purchase on a particular topic, is change the topic for a minute.
Yeah.
Switch to the law.
Okay.
There is very confusingly in philosophy of law and legal theory a label for a position, legal realism, which is just the opposite of moral realism.
Right.
So legal realism is the view that when you raise a question of law before a court, and that is before the judge has decided, there is no fact of the matter about whether a crime was committed. Claims that so-and-so broke the law are just not true until a judge convicts you. Something along those lines.
The judge's judgment is constitutive of the fact.
Exactly. Now, those people think of all the claims ahead ex ante that even if you believe them and you're making a claim that could be true or false, they aren't true. There's an alternative view there. The alternative view is, no, at least some of those claims are true because it's enough to make the charge true that there's a certain law in the books. Or a certain law in the books with a certain pedigree.
Yeah.
Or a certain law in the books with a certain pedigree with a certain history of precedence. Or, in effect, the kind of argument that lawyers standardly make are arguments at least as if what shows their defense or their charge true are these other features.
Yeah. And the judge can get it wrong.
And the judge can get it wrong. And they can challenge the judge's decision on the basis that they got it wrong. So, suppose you hold that latter view. So you hold in the law the equivalent of a moral realist view. There are facts about what the law is. Some of our claims are true. You might still go on and say, of course, in saying they're true, I'm not saying there's some otherworldly phenomenon. All the law is. And so all it takes for there to be true claims about you having done something illegal is that there are certain social practices in place, certain conventions. And you might go on and say, and by the way, these are incredibly salutary.
Yeah.
Without these, we'd be in deep trouble. But you're a person who's saying of the claim, you just broke the law, that could well be true before the judge makes any decision, and it's made true independent of what you happen to believe. Now we can carry that view, that exact view, over as a possible account of what morality is. Morality is just perhaps someone might suggest, uninstitutionalized laws.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a law where the enforcement mechanisms aren't backed by institution, and if there's threat involved in punishment, it all works sub-institutionally and interpersonally, not collectively and politically, or something like that. So you can imagine someone saying, and I think Hume had a view along these lines.
I find that quite attractive.
Right.
But then the difficulty that I run into if I present such a view, and I think that is sort of like my view, that I think that the moral facts are kind of very sort of deep, institutional facts. Much more shallower,
or conventional. Yeah.
Yes, like shallower. There are facts about baseball. What a home run is, how many home runs somebody hit in a year. These are facts. They're facts relative to a set of the rules of baseball, and there are facts about whether you've done something wrong or right. There's always going to be disagreement on the fringes, but those are right or wrong relative to a very deeply seated set of social conventions. But the difficulty you get with that kind of view is that then something can be wrong in one place and not wrong in another place because those places have different conventions. And a lot of people, when they say, I'm a realist about morality, they want to say that they're talking about, there's something that makes claims about rightness or wrongness true or false that transcends cultural differences.
So I actually don't think the problem is quite what you raised.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I think almost everyone thinks that whether some action you might perform is wrong here,
mm-hmm.
it's conceivable that in a different circumstance, maybe just different because of social conventions, it's not wrong somewhere else. I think the problem is, so I think almost everyone admits that a lot of what makes doing certain things wrong is sensitive to the context you're in.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take just two relatively familiar examples for philosophers. John Stuart Mill thought that absolutely, unconditionally, in every culture, an action is wrong if there's some alternative available to the agent that's better. And then he had a theory of what makes different alternatives better.
Mm-hmm.
But when you take that theory and you apply it in a particular case, what your options are largely shaped by the conventions in place.
Mm-hmm.
And what the effects of the different options are is highly dependent on the conventions and expectations of those you find yourself with. So, for instance, the question, is telling a white lie wrong? Or telling a bold lie wrong? Mill says, absolutely, unconditionally, in every culture, it depends. But on something very specific that applies across the board. What are the options, and what is their overall impact?
Well, then that's a question that ends up getting pushed back into his account of betterness, if you want to answer
right.
it at a deeper level. So then you've got the question of what makes it mandatory to have a certain conception of welfare, say, as
right.
as the thing that you're aiming at. Now, what's going to maximize welfare in a particular case is going to be bound up in the context. It's going to be bound up in the local social conventions. But not
according to Mill. According to Mill, there's a fact of the matter about what makes different options better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
His own view, his hedonistic view, is it's their connection to pleasure. But you could take his general view and say, look, this hedonism is not the right account of value.
Mm-hmm.
The right account is individual welfare. Or you might say, no, that's not the right account. The right account is preference satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might say, no, that's not quite the right account. It's informed preference satisfaction. What's interesting is each of these theories of value take a view, as you point out, that pretend to be true everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Even as, though they're true everywhere, supposedly, their upshot differs dramatically as you change from circumstance to circumstance. So let's say you were a consequentialist of Mill's stripe, but not a hedonist. So you thought, what makes one option better than another is its success in satisfying the preferences of those affected. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of view that plays a big role in public policy.
Yeah.
If you hold
most economists sort of think.
Sort of think, yeah. And if you hold that view, then you'll say an action that could be right here in the United States could be terrible in Denmark. Not because the actions differed intrinsically, but because given the environments and the expectations of others, there were a bunch of preferences there that aren't here, or vice versa. Let me just mention the other guy I was thinking of that has a similarly global universalist moral claim that is nonetheless highly sensitive to context.
Okay.
Just to sort of make the point that I think the problem isn't quite that what could be right in the United States could be wrong in Denmark. It's something slightly different, but it moves us in exactly the direction you want to, just on different grounds. So I think Kant is also, Immanuel Kant is also properly understood as saying to the question, well, is it right for me to do such and such? I think he thinks, in effect, the following. Absolutely, unconditionally, no matter what society you're in, it depends. It depends on why you would be doing it, Kant's phrase is what your maxim would be, and whether, in acting on that maxim, you'd be complying with the categorical imperative. Again, his view is whether in doing that you would be treating yourself and others as ends and not merely as means. But now it turns out exactly the same action as you shift from one culture to another culture. So you shift from agents who permissibly have one set of ends to another community where they have other expectations and ends. All of a sudden, what was perfectly okay to do here turns out not to be okay to do somewhere else. And so, I mean, it's hard to take two philosophers more opposed than Mill and Kant. They both, though, it seems to me, think that what's right in one place, except at this most abstract level, could be wrong in another place. I think what's really disturbing about the conventionalist account that treats morality simply as a more general, more abstract, perhaps less institutional instance of the law, is that we're disposed to make judgments of other cultures' institutions as morally wrong. And so it's that it seems we can imagine a culture that has a structure for coordinating interactions, systematizing and coordinating behavior of individuals, but all towards, and now I'll just connect it up to the other point in the way you set things up, all for evil ends. Where if we think the upshot of the coordination and convention is for ends we think aren't good, the temptation is to say complying with them is not being moral. Complying with them may be doing what in that society is viewed as moral, but our moral views are imperialistic in tendency. I mean, there are all sorts of ways to argue that this is a mistake, but we really, in ways that a lot of our legal views are not. We may see another legal system that we think is structured for bad ends, and on that basis claim that it's a very bad set of laws, and maybe laws that you morally shouldn't comply with. But what we're, I think, disposed to bring to the table in evaluating other legal systems is not our legal system.
Right.
So we don't go to the other legal system and say, oh, the problem with what you're doing is it would be illegal here.
Right.
Right. But we do tend to bring to the moral table the judgment, your practice of slavery under the circumstances you're in, that's wrong. Even though I know all of your conventions support it. And it's that fact that leads to people thinking, So what's your criterion, Will, for judging the ends achieved as good? Mm-hmm. Or what's somebody else's grounds for saying, well, those conventions are justifiable or fair, or whatever criterion you might be tempted to bring to the moral and political order of another society. And we're back to the problem of moral realism. How do you... What needs to be added besides all these conventions?
Well, it seems like everything gets pushed back to then trying to identify what this sort of end that everything needs to be geared towards is. So is there, so how do we adjudicate the dispute between someone with a mill-like conception of welfare as the end that our actions and conventions and so forth ought to be aiming at, or a sort of Kant-like, sort of somewhat more abstract idea about treating everybody as ends or having rules that could be, natural laws or whatever, however you want to formulate it. So what's the thinking about how to, here's a bunch of different ideas about the ends that we ought to be aiming at. People still disagree about that.
Right.
And there's a lot of what I think you could call moral disagreement between cultures about those sorts of things, where people in Western-style liberal democracies tend to be worried a lot about questions about welfare and questions about fairness and reciprocity. But those concerns don't have the same weight everywhere, where people, it seems like a moral impulse that people in, say, Saudi Arabia live under a certain kind of religious law, and their lives are organized more around ideas about sort of religious elevation and purity, performing your role adequately in the social structure, knowing your place, doing what the authorities say. And that sort of structure of life strikes me as a moral structure, but it doesn't look like they're aiming at the same thing. It doesn't look like they're thinking about welfare or about fairness in the same way. So do we need to be imperialist and just say that they're being wrong, or that they just have a fundamentally different conception of the aim of morality?
I'm not sure my phrase imperialistic is quite appropriate for what I had in mind.
Okay.
Unfortunately, because I think I can't right now come up with a better word, but I do think we're inclined to think it makes sense to ask about the in scare quotes moral order of other societies, whether it's really morally acceptable.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by the imperialism, is the willingness to take our standards and apply it somewhere else. On the other hand, I think it's part of our standards, or even if not part of our standards, part of the best way to conceive these things, that there's a permissible pluralism. Mm-hmm. That is, that it makes perfect sense, for instance, to say there are a bunch of things worth achieving. You can't achieve them all, and there are different acceptable good ways to reach appropriate outcomes. Mm-hmm. And they may be deeply incompatible. And so culture oriented around virtue would be very different than a culture oriented around protecting freedom, would be very different from a culture oriented around achieving perfection. Mm-hmm. One thing you might think is, freedom's all that matters, and these other things are valuable only as they're compatible with freedom. Mm-hmm. But an alternative view is, no, all of these things matter, and you can't maximally achieve each of them. And then there's a kind of permissible choice. But not a choice you can make as an individual alone, but that cultures make, perhaps. And in thinking about this, I find it useful, at least, to think about the slogan of the Bauhaus architectural movement, according to which the slogan is "form follows function." Mm-hmm. Now, to my mind, their actual architecture failed to live up to the slogan constantly.
Yeah, man.
So they regularly misidentified what the function of a building is or of a private home.
It's a machine for living.
Right. They just, but on the basis of their principle and their misunderstanding of it, they got rid of decoration and comfort and privacy and anything that didn't allow for efficiency of outcome, because they didn't realize that part of the function of a home is comfort and privacy. But let's take the slogan. The idea of the Bauhaus is you should start by sort of figuring out what the problem is. And then rate solutions according to whether they work well to solve that problem. And if you have that kind of idea, it's perfectly reasonable to think people coming together have a problem. The problem is how to get along well so that people can thrive. And you might here be appealing to the individual interests of the people. You don't need a conception of welfare. You can just say, here's the problem. There's each of us. We affect each other. We need to coordinate ourselves so that we can each do reasonably well without sacrificing other things we care about. So far, no, ends that are good or bad. You might have a view like that and then say, just as there are different, beautiful chairs, well-designed to sit in, none better than the other, except if you already own one, you don't want to get one that clashes with it. Similarly, there may be different ways to organize your moral culture that solves the problem morality is addressed to equally well. And you could hold that view and think, of course, there are some really crappy chairs. And there are some really crappy ways.
Well, there's going to be trade-offs in each of those societies.
In each of them, exactly. So, even the ones you think are good.
Yeah. So, and I think that sort of problem does recapitulate itself on an individual level, because I as an individual might wonder whether I want to devote my life to the pursuit of knowledge or the pursuit of beauty or the pursuit of justice, and each one of those things may be worth doing. But they may trade off against one another on certain margins, and
even not margins. They may trade off at quite central things.
Yeah, I might like I'm the most beautiful thing might turn out to be, the most artful possible homicide.
Right.
Right.
Or the most expensive thing. So
Yeah.
it might be absolutely the perfect chair can be built, but only using unobtainium. And if you have, in addition to trying to get beauty, the desire to eat, so you may have to, not just at the margin, decide between those two.
So I buy this idea then that there's a certain amount of reasonable pluralism in the kind of the design of the moral structure of society. And you can have lots of different societies whose form is built around an adequately moral function. It's aiming at one of the sort of reasonable moral ends. But I can still have preferences over those things. And I find that I do. And so I because I don't feel like there's at the beginning of one of his books, Robert Nozick has this argument about coercive philosophy, right?
Right.
And I don't feel like there's an argument that I can give people who are oriented to a different kind of, fundamentally different kind of conception of a moral society. That there's no argument that they have to accept lest their head explode. So what I've found myself doing, what I think of my policy work as a kind of applied moral theorizing, what I do is say, here's a bunch of evidence about what makes people happy. Here's a bunch of evidence about how long people live. Here's a bunch of evidence about under which systems people have, what average income. Here's evidence about educational attainment in different kinds of systems. Here's evidence about, and so on and so forth. And you throw that stuff forward, and then if you say, if you don't care, I can't tell you that you have to care about people living longer lives or being happier or being wealthier or, girls achieving a certain level of, of the realization of their capacities. I can't make you realize it, make you care. But I can. There is a point when if you offer a bunch of people all that evidence and they say I don't care, then I want to say, screw you. You're not that good a person. Would I be wrong to say that?
So let's separate out. One thing I completely agree you can't do is give an argument such that lest they buy it, their head explodes.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just true about the moral case. That's true about evolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's true about particle physics.
Right.
It's true about the existence of the moon. There's evidence you can marshal, there are arguments you can marshal, but they're of a form and force that a person can withstand their pressure. Mm-hmm. It's non-coercive in the head exploding way. And so let's go back a step. There are some things, I imagine, some different ways society might be organized where your view really is simply, as you put it at one point, I have my preferences. Mm-hmm. So where thinking that is not the same as also thinking, oh, and by the way, there sucks.
Yeah.
Morally. It's just, here's the kind of person I am, here's the kind of people I like to be around, here's the kind of freedom I think those people need and I like to have, and that other society doesn't have it, so give me my druthers, and my druthers are here. Mm-hmm. That's one kind of thing about which I find myself with tremendous preferences like that. Mm-hmm. I also find myself not just with preferences, but with certain judgments about ways societies could be organized where I don't just think I'd prefer not to be there or I'd prefer not to live that way.
Right.
But the way they organized it was bad or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Though ruthlessly efficient for the goals they happen to have. Mm-hmm. I find myself making those kind of judgments. Now, the case you gave is you find yourself working at the Cato Institute, you work hard on policy stuff, you do a lot of work on evidence about what makes people happy, about what it is to be happy, that you're able to marshal for purposes of building a case for a policy on a certain assumption. Mm-hmm. The assumption is you guys, too, agree or are willing to think that promoting happiness at not great cost is worth doing. Mm-hmm. Or making possible happiness for individuals without much intervention is worth doing. And I'm with you in thinking you'll bump up against people who say, I don't care about that. It's not that I think you're wrong about it. It's that it's just irrelevant. If we do that, I'm going to lose a lot of money. Or if we do that, you're going to be sticking your nose into my private life. Mm-hmm. Or if we do that, it may make most people happier, but it won't make me happy, and I don't care about other people. Mm-hmm. Any of those responses are such that then I can imagine you saying, you're bad people, one or another of those. Or you're failing to appreciate something that really is valuable. And those are the judgments that then kick up the problem. Are you just really cloaking your preferences?
Right.
Dressing them up in...
Well, usually the powerful arguments are, so what I'll be arguing is, say, here's evidence that a liberal, democratic, capitalist society with high rates of economic growth have all of these humanitarian benefits. Right. And then somebody will come by and say, well, yeah, okay, but look, what happens in those kinds of societies is that sort of traditional folkways are undermined, disappear, that you get a sort of debased commercial culture that kind of dissolves all of these sort of thicker identities over time. And I find my sort of thick identity in this kind of tight-knit community really, really valuable. So if that means that the people in my community are going to live less long or maybe be slightly less happy, at least they'll have this sense of meaning that they get from this. And I can see where they're coming from.
Right.
They make that kind of argument. But part of me wants to say, no, you really ought to care about living longer, or whether your daughter is going to be able to realize her full potential in that social structure. You really
That's
ought
a
to.
beautiful case, because that's right on. I think you've got your finger on exactly both kind of opposing opinion you can respect, as one an intelligent person could hold, but one about which you could also think they believe something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Either they believe that meaning is available only in this context, or they mistakenly believe the meaning available is worth more than realizing potential. Those kind of thoughts are thoughts that just invite then further debate. Because now the debate isn't, will it make her happy? The question now is, well, is there more to life than happiness?
Yeah.
Or let's forget happiness, because that's a broad term that gets difficult, but let's just take longevity. Mm-hmm. One of the standard indexes of social benefit is longevity. But there are also plenty of people I know who judge, as it seems to me perfectly reasonably, my main goal isn't to live as long as possible. Mm-hmm. I care not just about how long, but how well along other dimensions.
Yeah. And
there are people who sacrifice longevity for achievement, or for really good food, or for excitement. Mm-hmm. And there, I think we're facing a real question of two possibilities. Sometimes it looks like just a question of open preference. Mm-hmm. It's not that I think, as long as you acknowledge that in giving up an extra few years to do this, you're giving up something valuable. I'm not sure it's clear that you're giving up something more valuable than what you're getting.
Yeah.
That's one kind of view. But sometimes people do, and I love your case, because I think people make choices in the name of preserving culture at the expense of others. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes shrugging it off as just a difference morally difficult. Yeah. It makes it reasonable to fight for a policy that gives a woman a chance to realize her potential, even if you say, I grant you some sources of meaning are being lost here. But, my own disposition is to think, let's see how to put this. My own disposition personally about me is to think it's not just a matter of taste. Yeah. And if I get convinced it's just a matter of taste, then my willingness to fight about those things will dissipate. Yeah. The more I think, no, it's not really just about taste. Her welfare matters. The more I'm willing to say it's worth the cost, and I grant you meaning is a cost. Your meaning.
Well, Geoff, I'd love to continue this conversation, but our hour is flown by.
You're kidding.
I know. See, I told you. It goes fast.
Yeah.
But I would love to have you on again. Maybe we meant to talk about evolutionary approaches to morality. Maybe we can pick that up another time.
I would really enjoy that.
All right. Well,
thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for a stimulating conversation, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, great, Will. Thank you.
Bye, Geoff.